All right, there we go.
All right, well, welcome everyone. And I'm going to let Nate kind of kick us off tonight. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Katie, for kind of getting us going and pinch hitting given some of the circumstances. And good to have
mhm.
you back, Kirk. Always a pleasure. And this
Well,
is
thank
a
you.
this is a really this is a really cool topic. And I think it's something sometimes we maybe glance over sometimes quickly. Like ethics might be a footnote, which is unfortunate, but Kirk has some really incredible expertise. Um, just a great friend of the program, has been on the board for a while. Just been a real support, for myself personally as a student, but also as someone who I think really highly of as a role model and a colleague. So really happy to have Kirk. So we're gonna do some intros here. We'll do his guest lecture on ethics, end of life, some of his work in the field, and then we'll kind of go to a Q&A and wrap class up hopefully before 8 o'clock tonight. If you want to go to the next slide here, Katie. So first, I'd like to just do an introduction for you all. I think this is all our first class together. So we'll do a name, location, and organization, and a favorite Thanksgiving tradition. And Becky, you're first on my screen, so I'll let you take it away.
Hello, thank you for spending your time with us tonight. My name is Becky Keyser. I live in Paynesville, Minnesota. I currently work as an insurance biller at Alamere, but on December 1st, I'm going to join the team at Essentia Health as a health information supervisor. My favorite Thanksgiving tradition, besides everybody getting together, is Christmas tree shopping at the Christmas tree farm.
It's never too early, Becky. I love it.
I
I
know,
love it.
I know, I know.
My tree's been up for about 3 weeks. Don't tell anyone that yet. But it's snowing outside here in Duluth, so I think I get a pass this time.
Mine would have been up that early, but I live with someone who's like, that's too early. I'm like, no, it's not.
I'm on your side here. I'm on your side. Cool. Good stuff. Angie.
Hi, my name is Angie DeBruzzi. I currently live in Hudson, Wisconsin. I work for Fairview as an imaging supervisor. I have three sites in the Twin Cities. My favorite Thanksgiving tradition is actually kind of a funny one because my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law do all the cooking, and my husband likes to critique them. And it's always a guess each year on what he's going to say about the cooking.
Good things, I hope.
Yeah,
Good things, I hope. Some gratitude. My
such a
goodness.
critic.
Oh my goodness. Good
my,
stuff. Good
my
stuff.
grandma would say there's a restaurant up the street.
Kicking to the curb. I love it. Katie, what about you? What about you? I think this is our first class here together.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So Katie Kerr, I live in Mora, Minnesota, and so I'm the direct program director for the Health Information Management Master's program, and then the program director for the MHA program now. Um, I just have to laugh because Angie's story about her husband critiquing, because my husband is always critiquing the turkey at Thanksgiving, whether it's like too dry, or one year my dad did it and it was way too dry, he said, and then his mom did it and it was better. So I'm doing it this year, so hopefully it'll all be good. But I just love getting together with my family. We get together, uh, like 3 times a year, and this is my turn to host this year, 20 people. And so I'm just really excited to have a full house. So
good stuff. Good
yeah,
stuff. And then if you want to go to the next slide here, I can
sure.
introduce Kirk. And my favorite Thanksgiving tradition, it's more of a memory. When I was in fifth grade, I sneezed all over our Thanksgiving dinner and ruined it. That's the only time I got kicked out to the stoop as a kid. So for any critics out there, it can't get much worse than that. Dr. Allison, lovely to have you. And an intro on him here. I mean, it kind of speaks for itself. He taught here at the College of St. Scholastica Health Humanities program for 8 years, from 2017 to 2025. Teaching on history of medicine, trauma and recovery, health, happiness, and human well-being. He was also directed the program in human rights and health of the University of Minnesota School of Public Health for 10 years, from 2006 to 2016. And very robust academic background, undergrad and MA studies from the University of Kansas and University of Erlangen-Nuremberg in German and computer science, a PhD from the University of Minnesota in Germanic studies. And I'd love to hear some more about your dissertation too, if you want to say a couple words
Mhm.
to that, Kirk. I think that's fascinating.
Yep, sure. Yeah, I did my dissertation on a person named Gottfried Benn, who was a physician poet. He lived from 1886 to 1956. He worked under, he was a dermatologist, pathologist, psychiatrist, military medical doctor in both world wars. He was a Rosenberg eugenics enthusiast with a Jewish girlfriend at one point. So he was a bundle of contradictions. His father was a pastor. He sort of went the Nietzschean route, but he ended up working in Berlin at the Charité Hospital in psychiatry for a brief stint under Dietrich Bonhoeffer's father. And I don't know if you know Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a theologian, a Lutheran theologian who was in the United States, and then he returned to Germany when Hitler came to power, had an underground seminary. He wrote a little book about it called Life Together, which is worth reading. And and so Ben's father was a pastor. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's father was a psychiatrist and sort of pioneered psychosomatic medicine. And Ben's fiance's or wife's last name was the same as Bonhoeffer's fiance's last name in Berlin. So there's all these. I was interested in the intersections of the disciplines and also the literature in which there were certain transgressions of sort of Hippocratic ethics in some of the dramatic sketches that he wrote. And I was interested in the question of, again, ethics and politics, eugenics, and these sorts of things. And since he wrote poems also on his experiences doing pathology, including in the morgue. And to sort of get a phenomenological feel of that, I sat in on the medical school gross anatomy course and shadowed the gross anatomy lab. And I was an EMT at the time also. And when the medical students who were paying lots of money, and I wasn't paying any money to be there, at least for that angle, when they were tired dissecting, then I dissected. And then I did a rotation at the medical examiner's office for Hennepin County, a research rotation, and was there for the morning social reviews of the people that had come in, and was there for decisions on who would have an autopsy, who wouldn't. One time going out picking up somebody, being there at the autopsies, including doing charting, some charting, weighing organs, and this sort of thing. And what was very striking was how you get a sense of what's going on in the city in a different way, and particularly about vulnerable people and people that we would call vulnerable patients, and the care and the sense of obligation that we have to the dead, even not only to the living, but also the dead, and that a person is not simply gone when they die. And that's certainly a Catholic point of view and a Christian point of view, that were persons which have a continuing existence. And it was very interesting. There was one woman, I'll just give you one example. There was a Native American woman who was homeless who died on the street. And I remember seeing her on the table, and she was missing part of one digit, one finger, and across her knuckles were tattooed LOVE. And so this is a person who had a life with maybe addiction, maybe mental health things, a person who was marginalized, a person who probably died of exposure, perhaps, or of an overdose. And she desired love in her life, and we didn't know who she was. And so oftentimes the medical examiner's office doesn't give out a lot of detailed information, but there was a very strong effort to link her up to a community that she came from and that would care for her in death, even if it wasn't that successful in life. And so it was a very strong lesson on the importance of relationship and the importance of love as it intersects even forensic medicine and these very clinical and legal contexts. So that was part of what I did, and then I went to the Marbach Literature Archive in for modern literature, where Ben's library was, including his medical books and many of his literary books, his manuscripts, and went through his medical books and his letters and various other things related to the political tensions that he found himself in On the one hand, he was seen as being kind of a good doctor inside the Third Reich. On the other hand, he was considered a degenerate artist for being an expressionist. And and I found actually a letter from Heinrich Himmler, of all people, who got him off the hook when the Schwarzer Korps, which was an SS journal, was going after him. And so he was a kind of curmudgeonly figure who didn't fit well in any categories. He wasn't a war criminal, but he wasn't all that sympathetic. But he had lots of insights also, and it just showed the sort of the complexity of how a person, I thought, also in terms of some of the medical ethical things, could also go astray. So that was my dissertation. So it included archival work, it included being at autopsies, and it included a lot of debts to people that were very generous to allow me access to all sorts of things.
Absolutely. And I mean, just what it kind of glimpse into the work Kirk is doing and sort of his expertise and care to, this part of healthcare and healthcare leadership. One thing he'll talk about a lot tonight, you can see that bottom bullet point, is the issues of some forced organ harvesting in China. He actually testified before the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations on the Committee of International Relations in the House of Reps in the 109th Congress. So just really incredible expertise and really incredible care to this type of work. So lovely to have Kirk with us today, and just been a wonderful friend of the program. So with that, Kirk, I know you were thinking about sharing slides from your end. If you kind of want to take it away here.
Sure. And as you can tell, that's kind of a so I'm sending a request to share here. Let's see. And
I think
so
I approved it.
I'm going to get the entire screen here. Yeah,
Okay.
screen. Yeah. So, and then I'll go to slideshow and from the beginning. Okay. And then I'll try to get this guy out of my face here. Okay. As you can tell, that's sort of a long question of how does your German PhD have anything to do with medicine, ethics, and public health? And so when I started doing works, and it looked like a longer term engagement with the program in human rights and medicine, which then became the program in human rights and health, I did an add-on degree in health services research policy and administration with a bioethics minor and MS as well, and it was very that was a very fruitful thing, and I'm trying to get this thing to forward. Okay, now it's going. So we've already done all of that, so I'll blast through this. So when we're thinking about ethics, I just want to go back one sleep. Okay. So yeah, ethics and healthcare administration is the basic focus here. And I want to think generally ethics in what sense? And there's some interesting things. You'll have a chance to exercise your ability to do ancient Greek here, which you will be able to do and when we're done. Ethics in Catholic healthcare institutions and significance of the ethical and religious directives, and the question of sometimes you hear of mission creep. There's the question of Catholic healthcare in the world, including the secular world. Is there mission sleep? One could ask. There's a few things on end of life issues, and on an administrative example of an instrument used and it was developed in Minnesota, the POLST form, which is a standing orders form for end of life. And we'll be looking at two different versions of them. And the question is, what does this form do and how does it function within an institution? And does one way that it was originally published, does it push for certain outcomes compared to a later revision? And how does that intersect with ethical issues? And then a bit on the China forced organ harvesting context. So just to say, when you hear the word ethics, what comes to mind? And anybody can say anything here.
Personal principles.
Okay, personal principles. Okay, and the word principles is really good. Okay, because the idea of principles means that there's some foundations to them. There's some structure. It's personal. It has to do with you as an individual. but it's a reflected sort of thing. It's not just an ad hoc emotional response or something. Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
I think about morals, Kirk.
Okay, morals. Okay. And we'll be talking about different words in having to do with ethics in Greek and the terms and how that intersects with morals or just simply habits, right? And we talk about an ethos. Sometimes you hear that word, and that can just mean the culture, right? The general culture of a place. But it could be anything. Mother Teresa had her ethos, and obviously Dr. Mengele, who had a PhD from Munich and an MD from University of Leipzig, and was a member of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. He had his, right? So the question is, what is ethics, morals, ethos, these sorts of things? Okay, and there's both personal, professional, and institutional, and in this way, one may be wearing different hats, and one may have certain latitudes and certain freedoms, or even certain collisions depending on what hat one is wearing. And if the collisions are strong enough, then you may have to make a hard choice about whether you want to remain in a context or not, or report something or not. Okay. So when you think of ethics, one question is what sort of actors and peoples are involved? What considerations come into play? One can think of medical ethics on the one hand, say public health ethics on another. And there's a different, as we all experienced rather regrettably during COVID, right? That there's significant differences between those two contexts. And in fact, one may be sacrificed to the other, right? With the shutting down of a lot of elective stuff, quote, and a lot of diagnostic stuff, there are people in the name of public health ethics of shutting down things, and there was all sorts of critiques of this. There were all sorts of people who later suffered medically as a result of misdiagnoses and other things like that. Okay. And then this question of who or what is impacted, and the who is people. It could be also in some cases animals, and the what could be structures, support systems, families, education, and whatnot. Okay. So so here's a little word cloud, and some of those things that pop up are things that we've mentioned a little bit. We could include things like action, behavior, theory, the question of truth in there. We had people, we had ethos, human relation, principles we included, moral we included, evolutionary science, business ethics. That's an important one also. And of course, we talk about even the language of business talks about goods and services, and those are actually morally, ethically charged words. So a service is the same as in the word of ministry, right? This service used to serve another person, goods and services. One could talk about good, bads, and neutrals, right? So there's all sorts of things that money exchanges hands. There's sex trade, there's all sort of drug trade, there's all sorts of things, and those are all economically enmeshed activities, but they wouldn't be something that would fall anywhere under something like business ethics. And I always enjoy talking to students who are in business or in accounting, and I have an interesting story. Probably won't have time for it, but it's also kind of related to somebody who was in a work camp in China and came here and was an auditor for state health insurance program contracts. And when he was told basically to change numbers on his analysis of his audit. Well, I'll give you the short version. So the guy, he was in, this happened to be in New Mexico. He was right beneath the political appointees. He was the not political appointee. And there's this revolving door, like in the pharmaceutical industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, it's FDA and the pharmaceutical companies. And in the health insurance business, it's often the commissioner of health or commissioner of insurance and people going into commercial insurances who are also giving bids. And there was a bid of a friend of the commissar of insurance, and he basically told Zhao Tian, my former roommate from the University of Kansas, to change some numbers in his assessment of the bid, and Zhao Tian said no. Now, Zhao Tian's father died during the Cultural Revolution in a re-education camp, And then Zhao Tian was thrown in there and turned big rocks into little rocks and had to be the last group. He was the oldest group that could still get out of there and make it to college. And Zhao Tian basically said, no, I'm not going to change it. And the guy basically implied, well, I can cost you your job. And Zhao Tian thought, that's a threat? He said, this is a threat. If you're starving in re-education camp and you kill a chicken and you're caught and you get shot, that's a threat. Threaten me that I'm going to lose my job when I can get another, that's no threat. And then shortly after, that commissioner got canned for corruption. So so business ethics, auditors, accountants are very important bulwarks against things like corruption, for example. Okay. Then you can think of the MHA in particular. And here we have this description of the course. It provides a current orientation to current healthcare business environment, service delivery systems, a broad-based perspective of key environmental factors influencing current and future trends in healthcare, and an approach it helps students to develop a context for synthesis, discussion, and analysis of contemporary issues and trends. And there's all sorts of interests. There's all sorts of actors and ethical issues involved. And so when you're thinking about healthcare administration and ethics, a few questions may help. And the first one is sort of a primary philosophical question. What sort of thing is healthcare? Okay. What's within the bounds of healthcare? What's without the bounds of healthcare? All right. So, for example, if one is a transhumanist and one wants to have body modification or try to do mental modifications beyond pharmacological or other things beyond normal species typical capacities, is that part of healthcare? Okay. Or is that something else? It's using medical techniques, medical technology, medical things. I just finished, there's an article which I have a slide on at the end, which I saw in a history. It's looking at the history of medical homicide, which means intentional actions, lethal actions in medicine. And I have a comparison of the 17th century, 18th century of France and the guillotine and 20th century not assisted suicide, but lethal injection, execution, and all of the medical trappings, the requirements that the people be medically certified, that you need to have a medically certified phlebotomist to establish the lines, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, it's all of the trappings, but is that medicine, right? Just because it's using the trappings and requiring medical training, et cetera. Okay. And then another question is, for healthcare, what are its goals and what are its means? Okay. What are the goods that it's trying to secure, and what are the means? And is every mean to a good end acceptable? And then what is the nature of administration? And what's interesting in here is this word minister again. Okay. Administration. And ad has this idea of towards or for something in Latin, ad. And then an additional question is, what virtues of the persons working in healthcare are needed for healthcare administration to be good? Okay. What are the practical virtues that are needed? And this is within oneself, and this is also within the social community. So community virtues and individual virtues. Okay. So here we'll do a little bit of Greek. And if ethics, this is a lovely site. This etymolon.com. Just put in any word in etymology in a Google search and it'll pop up. It's a lot of fun to just go and monkey around with this. So ethic in the late 14th century had to do with the study of morals. It comes from Greek ethika, and feminine form ethikos, ethical, pertaining to character, and ethos. Now, this is interesting. With the long E, that's with an eta. It means moral character and also related to custom. But ethos is with a short E with an epsilon. And we'll look at that a little bit. So, and in the 1650s, moral principles of a person or a group. So, on the one hand, you have ethos with an epsilon here, which has to do with customs and habits. And that could be anything, any cultural customs or habits. And then you have ethos, which includes customs, habits, and disposition, but also character, and especially moral character. And what's interesting is that there's a contrast here between ethos and dianoia, which basically means intellection in Greek. And when people are talking about, we have a particular one could say in the in academic context, because intelligence, quote, or being smart is so highly valued. There's a lot of what I would call occupational hazards with high intelligence. Also, things like high arrogance is often often a thing. And when you think about it, if you had 100 people with Down syndrome, people with Down syndrome often have a limited intelligence, but they often have a lot of relational, emotional intelligence. And if you drug out the idea of doing a genocide, which in the genocide against the Armenians by the Ottoman Empire, physicians were involved in the organizing of it. In the German genocide against the Jews, the Gypsies, or the Sinti and Roma, physicians were prominent, and particularly psychiatrists with the T4 program, which started the killing off of people in mental institutions. Later, like Irmfried Eberl ended up being the first commandant of Treblinka camp. You know, if you rolled out these ideas to 100 people with Down syndrome, and you said, would this be a good idea from a moral point of view? I bet you would get 100 out of 100 that that would say it's a bad idea. If you look at the history of the Nazi Party and you look at the profession that was most represented before 1933, that is before Hitler came to power, the number one profession in the Nazi Party was medicine before 33. Number two was law. Okay. So so this question of the ethical and the moral, it's different than just the intellection. It's different than intellectual, and it has to do with a realm that's real. And I like to say to students, morals and the ethical moral realm is as real as rocks and water. Okay, it's as real as right. And if people don't understand, and there's a spiritual dimension to it as well. And if people don't believe that, then I just say this is a good sort of door into it. I say, have any of you experienced or participated in being kind or being cruel? Okay. If anybody that's been to junior high has probably been, or middle school has been on both ends of that equation, perhaps. But kindness and cruelty are a moral relationship that exists, and the thought and the things that come out as actions are dealing with a realm that exists before the action is manifested physically. And it's a relationship to a vulnerability, to a person who is vulnerable, which means literally from Latin, woundable. Okay, kindness and cruelty are both opposite reactions in the same plane, and they're real. They are real things, and everybody that's experienced them or felt violated or felt repentant, needing to repent of something, know that. And so again, the reality of the moral realm is just as real as quarks or physics or anything in that realm. Okay. Now, when you're thinking about moral judgment and ethics, one can think in a number of dimensions. And what's interesting about different moral theories and approaches, there may be general ones that provide a outside framework, but certain considerations on a particular problem might draw on other moral frameworks. So when you're thinking about moral judgment, you can think about some aims of moral goals, or goals which involve moral judgment. So a goodness of an outcome, it could be happiness, it could be fulfillment, it could be health, it could be beauty, it could be knowledge. There could be general constraints like don't harm, don't be unfair. And it's interesting, in German, there's a word for right and wrong. You can just say Recht, das ist nicht recht. But they've come to use the word fair from English a lot. This idea of fair. And one would say, aber das ist aber nicht fair. But that's not fair. And they use the word fair. It's a interesting borrowing. Respect for autonomy, justice, and special obligations. Well, there are moral obligations, things like keeping your promises. So a promise is a kind, and one can think of fiduciary obligations, right? When you're acting in the best interest of somebody else. A promise is a kind of commitment. And it's interesting, Evagrius in the fourth century, or the fifth century, the fourth or fifth century, he said that a vow is a freely entered in commitment to do the good. So his idea of a vow is related to something which is good. So if somebody's in a mafia context and you make a vow to go murder somebody, a vagrant would say that's not a valid vow because it's not related to the good. To satisfy your roles. So here you have role obligations. So when you're working as a nurse or an administrator, you have one set of obligations. When you're working, you're as a mother or a friend or a family member, you have other obligations. Protect your family, and then questions of options: is extreme sacrifice obligatory or obsessive altruism, or permissive? Is it or what about self-interest? Okay, and there's a philosopher when I was at the University of Munich. I didn't take his course, unfortunately. I was doing a lot of stuff I had a Fulbright and I was doing a lot of stuff. There was German literature stuff, but I was doing some things in the theology department and philosophy science department. And one of my theology professors said, "Oh, have you had something with Spemann?" I said, "No, not yet." And he said, "Oh, you really should do something. He's a remarkable." And then the second semester was coming, and I had to do all my official stuff also. Stop having so much fun. But anyway, Robert Spemann, there's a book he has that's I think in the collection there on persons, the difference between someone and something, which is a great book. But I saw him in a video in which he's being interviewed, and he says in German, kind of shockingly, he says, "Der Altruismus ist gar keine christliche Haltung." And and what he meant was, or maybe he said sittliche Haltung, nicht christliche, sittliche Haltung, which if translates, altruism is not at all a moral, ethical stance from a Christian position view, and which sounds pretty shocking. If altruism means you're always second, in Spamann's point of view, he was saying loving your neighbor as yourself means that you also love yourself. And it also means that sometimes the neighbor is first and sometimes you are first. And there's a function of prudential wisdom that comes into play about which case is which for individual judgment. So naked altruism is a distortion because it doesn't recognize that you also have legitimate needs and interests. And then wisdom is to be able to figure out in the context when what is the proper priority. There are various theories, divine command theory, for example, which has to do with authority. So one can think of the word author, authority, and this is something I got from Ellis Potter, who was one of my former tutors when I was in Switzerland between high school and university. He was a former Zen Buddhist monk who'd become a Christian and was a very interesting fellow, and we're still in touch. But he talks about authority. A person who is an authority, whether it's a parent or a scientist, has the ability to create, define, or describe reality. Okay. And from a divine command point of view, God has that ability, let there be light, or something like that, or moral things, do not murder, do not kill, do not commit adultery, things like that. And so the question is, who is the author? And Ruth Graham, is in Billy Graham's wife, had this when they were talking about genetic engineering and playing God. And she said, "Well, I don't know. If I was going to play Joan of Arc, I'd try to find out everything about Joan of Arc, what kind of person she is, etc. So if I'm going to play God, I would probably want to try to find out what kind of characteristics does God have, and is what I'm doing under that banner really consistent with that?" Then natural law theory has to do with the nature of things structured in creation or in nature, with an idea that there are structures, there are coherences, and one can derive principles from these coherences. And somebody like Thomas Aquinas was very strong in his understanding of natural law, also being correlative, with some things you could only know from revelation, but many things you could know, and anybody could know from looking at the structure of things. Okay. Virtue ethics puts the focus on the moral grounding and the character traits and the development of the person. Okay. So it makes one's own life, one's own moral, religious, spiritual, whatever life, a project of development, which applies in various areas. Utilitarianism, many of you have heard the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay. So that seems to be a good thing, but what if it means sacrificing people who are weak? Okay. Or in the context of the Chinese situation with the persecution of Falun Gong, you can certainly have a lot more organ transplants if you use a supply of political prisoners as sources, for example. Okay. And then deontology, that's just a deontology, deontos is just a fancy word for duty. And sometimes you might think of Immanuel Kant um, and the categorical imperative. So natural law, what kind of being, what kind of thing do we have? Utilitarianism, outcome. One of the criticisms of utilitarian ethics is is that oftentimes you can't predict what the outcomes will be. And secondly, what's the limiting principle? And virtue ethics, character and practice, and deontology, duty. And maybe you've seen this. And some people think it's kind of a gloss, perhaps, on the golden rule. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, if in the moral realm, he says in matters of taste, there's no disputing. It doesn't matter if you like pepperoni and I like Canadian bacon, or I like cheese, or I like vegan pizza. Okay, well, when you get to animals, maybe there's some moral things we could talk about as well. But those are matters of things of aesthetics, of frequently matters of taste. There's not a moral issue, but on the questions of life and death issues, there are moral issues. And so, am I going to act in the way, or in my business practices, that I could will that it be a universal law? That is, that everybody in this situation would act in that way. Also, if I were in the situation in the opposite position, like I wasn't the authority, I wasn't the boss, I was the employee, for example, or I wasn't the physician, I was the patient, for example. Okay. So there's various ways you can think about nesting these things. So consequentialism, you're thinking about the goodness of outcome. Deontology, you're thinking about general constraints. Contractarianism, you're thinking about perhaps special obligations. And a good example where deontology, you want to, for example, have maximize the health in a population, or maximize the well-being of people during an epidemic. But if you have a situation like COVID, or you have a situation in which you have a limited number of doses of a medicine, how do you decide who gets the doses and who doesn't, or who gets the ventilators and who doesn't, right? And there was an interesting discussion by one bioethicist. If his name pops in my mind, I'll report it here. But he was in Africa, and he asked in the United States and Africa the same question. Okay, you have this epidemic, and you only have 20 doses, and 25 people need it, and only the people who get it are going to survive, and those that don't going to survive. Who are you going to give the doses to? And most of the Americans said, "Oh, well, the people who are super old and have lived most of their life and had a good life, they don't have many lives left. Well, we're not going to give it to them. We'll give it to the younger people, okay, who have more lives, who have more time on the clock, so to speak." The people in Africa said, "Oh, young people and young fools are a dime a dozen. The knowledge and wisdom of our culture is in our old people. Of course, we're going to give it to the old people. That's where the repository of wisdom is." So both of those are sort of utilitarian things, right? But with different cultural logics. And in some cases, maybe you do a procedural ethics sort of thing in which you just say, okay, we want to come up with a fair procedure, and it may be even little bit random. It may be a little bit of John Cage in it, where you say, okay, how is a procedure is established, on what grounds is it consistently followed? What good is supported, what interests are observed, who are the stakeholders, how does it apply in various contexts? So if there's not enough, maybe sometimes you just do it by random lot. You could flip a coin and say, I'd like to give it to everybody, but there's not enough to go around, and so this is the way we're going to do it. But the idea is that there's some agreement on the procedure in advance that everybody can live with it, even though the outcomes are not always going to be great. And in sort of these lifeboat ethics contexts, we shouldn't confuse the idea that what comes out is justice. No, what comes out, if justice is getting your due or what's good for you as a human being, which respects your dignity, the value that can't be traded away, as a human being, in many situations, we don't get justice. We get an accommodation to a bad situation. And I think it's helpful to not say, oh, this utilitarian solution is really just calling it just. No, it's not justice, but it's making the best of a bad situation. So involves ends and means. In a moral universe, both the ends and the means should be praiseworthy. You can think about this institutionally. And there's a means, this includes the virtue of prudence. So we talked about this a little bit about love your neighbor as yourself, right? Prudence also has the idea of when can I judge the cases. So in theology, prudence is a cardinal virtue along with justice, fortitude, and temperance. And it has to do with distinguishing what is fit. And it tends to be a bit of a conservative one. In other words, if you say there's this standard in law, the prudent person test, does anybody know what that is? Okay. So if somebody dies in the form of an accident, okay, let's say it could be an industrial accident or it could just be out on the street. If somebody backs up or is backing their car and runs over somebody, they would say, did a prudent person would look in the rearview mirror to see if somebody was behind there, right? Uh, and if they were behind there, then and if they didn't look, they'd say you didn't act as a prudent person in that situation, so you have more guilt. If the person had if the person had snuck up behind the car and it's dark out and got down behind it and was going to attack the driver and the driver happened to back up and run over him, okay, they looked in the rearview mirror, he didn't run over him on purpose or what, you know, then they'd say, well, the driver did act prudently, even though the guy got ran over, etc. Okay. So one of the things you can think a little bit about your own life and your own work context or study context, how to define prudence as an instrumental value. So that means it's a means to an end, right? And one of the first thing is the virtue of choosing perhaps the best means or a good means to a praiseworthy goal, or at least a neutral means. Okay. And sometimes it also involves choosing among competing goods and means. And so you see this in public health and in healthcare budgets. How much do you put in prevention and how much do you put in treatment, right? So public health is like give us more for prevention, medicine is more give us more for treatment, right? And you sort of come to these accommodations, and partly they're sort of arrived out sort of from the gut a lot of times. You can do studies, you can run models, you can do regressions, you can do all these sorts of things. But there's sort of a sensibility of when things are sort of in proportion, out of proportion, and prudence is involved in choosing between the goods and the means. And it's also prudence is a practical wisdom and judgment in the realm of healthcare administration. So developing your prudence muscles, so to speak, is really good for both personally and also for healthcare administration. And you might think of a work context or practice context where you had to uh, exercise the virtue of prudence. Does anything come to mind where you had like multiple things calling for your attention or multiple goods or multiple means, and you came into a decision finally on one or another?
When I used to work in the cath lab, um, we would have the patients on the table, and if they were to need life-saving, measures, and then
Mhm.
we would, have to stop and talk to the family and try to make a decision on what we were going to do. And there's always some types of ethical dilemmas in that kind of scenario.
Sure. Yeah, that's really right. And when we look at this pulse thing, the form at the end, which has to do with end of life care fundamentally, orders concerning end of life care. There's one which I always like to say there's a principle you should apply when you're thinking about advanced directives, and it's the principle don't paint yourself in a corner. So that would be like if I say I never want a respirator. Well, maybe you only need a respirator as a bridge, right? And both in secular bioethics and Catholic bioethics, if a treatment is burdensome, is extreme, you don't have to continue it if it's an extraordinary treatment, you know. But if you say I never want a ventilator, then that might put you in a spot where you wouldn't really want to be, you know, in that. And what you're saying about the families and there's also different interests and views within families and that's difficult. And when I was at the program, sometimes we would get called because we were the program in human rights and health or medicine, depending on whether we were in medical school or the public health school at the time. And sometimes it would be something going on in the hospital, and the family would call me or call us and say, we would like to have you at this meeting. And I always like to run the healthcare ethics meeting, so to speak. I would come in, and I didn't have any official authoritative. I didn't have any power, but I had a little bit of authority, if you know the difference, right? And I'd say, well, first of all, I want the family to have a chance to say, first of all, I want the family to be able to say what all has gone wrong in this whole process that you see that you wish would be better for everybody. And they would have some complaint, like this guy came in and was going to give him this drug, and we knew it was the wrong drug, and he wouldn't listen to, you know, or some other thing. And they'd kind of get stuff out of the chest. Then I would ask the family, what's your ideal outcome? Well, a lot of times it was to stabilize the person well enough so they could come home and die peacefully at home or something like that. They weren't wanting some crazy extenuated treatment that was physiologically futile. You know, they were just wanting a certain thing and sort of give them that thing. And then oftentimes it was much easier to kind of come to a rapprochement. Yeah. And then there's quite, can there be a prudent course to a bad, unethical, immoral, or evil end? And Aquinas and I would say no. There may be less damaging things done for a bad end, but it's sort of like Evagrius and the thing with a vow, a promise. It's not a you can't make a vow to something that's evil. That's not a valid vow. And so there's not a prudent course to an evil end. You have to have the end in line, and then you want to have the means in line. And from a healthcare administration point of view, you can think about the relationships between prudence, law, regulations, and policies and constraints on the healthcare administrator. And there's policies which don't make a lot of sense in many contexts. There's policies that make tons of sense in many contexts. There's policies that work for most of the cases, but they don't work for the extreme cases, right? And so this brings to bear the need for prudence and the need sort of on the political level if there's policies, whether they're institutional or legal policies passed by the Minnesota legislature, then there needs to be attention given to these. And usually, if there's a big medical scandal, that's when there's extra laws and that are applied to medicine, right? If there's a big scandal, that's when there's sort of deprofessionalization that takes place. Professions are self-regulating. That's one of the hallmarks of professions. When they fail to self-regulate, then there come in other laws, and you could think about the cadaver scandal at Harvard, for example, that and what happened in Massachusetts. And, you know, and then you can think, what are your options if you cannot ethically, morally abide institutions' policies or your institution's policies or the external mandates that are placed on it? You know, you have different things. There's whistleblowing possibilities in some contexts. There's protests. There's my sister from going from the ER marching to the medical director's office and saying some of these residents are going to kill my patient, you know, if you don't get them under control. Um, or you can quit your position. You know, you can resign in protest, right? I mean, you have different options. And of course, when you think about medical ethics in general, you would think in the Western context of Hippocrates in the 5th century, This is the most ancient papyrus we have. This is a medieval one in which they also have a preamble and sort of a cruciform writing of it, also in Greek still. And what's kind of interesting about this is here's the Greek and here's the English. Um, I swear by, what's interesting about this, I swear by something which is greater than myself, okay? And here you have Asclepius, this is Apollo the healer, Hygieia, like the word hygiene, Panacea, like panacea, right? And by all the gods and goddesses. So whoever was writing this, if it was Hippocrates or people with him, they're making this as general. I'm appealing to something greater than myself that I'm responsible to. It's not just my own invention that I will carry out according to my ability and judgment. So that's like the prudence element, right? And this one is good. Hold my teacher in this arts equal to my own parents to make him a partner in my livelihood. At the end, there'll be a Venmo code for me that I'll be providing you. Tuition is for the regular teachers. The Venmo code will be for me. Just wanted to include that with the authority that I have from a puck. And then there's this line which people say, "Do no harm." That isn't in the form that we usually hear it, but I will do no harm or injustice to them, to my patients. Okay. And I will keep pure and holy both my life and my art. So here there's an element of it that has to do with character, keeping pure my life and my art. And the art is the technical side, right? It's technical competency, it's instrumental competency. And there's also this bit about what's my lane. So I will not use the knife on sufferers from the stone, but I will give place to such as craftsmen therein. This is where there was the physicians and the surgeons, right? And so you have your scope of practice and your scope of competency, and you do yours and you leave the others to others. I will abstain from all intentional wrongdoing and harm. And it's interesting here, especially from abusing bodies of men, of women, bond or free. Okay, slave or free. So the physician isn't going to abuse them. Whatsoever I hear, whatsoever I shall see or hear, if it be what should not be published abroad, I will never divulge it, holding such things as holy secrets. So this is HIPAA. Okay, so this is HIPAA. And there's also about not administering a deadly poison, even if asked to do so. And I will carry out this oath. May I gain a reputation. And if I fail, may the opposite befall me. So there's so much in here that is what continues. Now, in ethics, you've probably seen this quartet. Have you seen these four before, which is Childress and Beauchamp, non-malfeasance, beneficence, justice, autonomy. There's other ways you can put it together. But one thing to think about is, does the ordering of this matter? So non-malfeasance is not doing bad. Beneficence is doing good. Justice has to do with the interests of multiple parties and getting what's due, and autonomy has to do with sort of self-determination, okay? Literally a law to oneself, autonomos, okay? So does the order of these matter? And like I was saying, are there secondary impacts of prioritizing one or the other? And one of the question is, what is the context that these are operating in? Who are the actors, the decision makers, who's affected? And how might context change the evaluation of these four that are just kind of spit out like, here they are, these are them. So think if you're in medicine as a patient, how do these things look from your perspective? What if you're in medicine as a physician or as a nurse or as a janitor? Okay. The person who's wiping down the walls is saving more people that day than the surgeon is. Okay. In your private capacity, just as a regular person, in your hospital administrator capacity. Okay. Now, if you're the public health commissioner, okay. So we know with autonomy, if you don't, in medicine, medical ethics, if you don't want to take your antibiotics for your highly drug resistant TB and you're going to die from it, they allow that. Or if you don't want to take your insulin, people won't force you to take it, right? Even if you live 20 years, right? But if you're going to, as a public health commissioner, if somebody's not going to take their pharma for a highly drug-resistant TB, you're not going to let them ride the blue line and the green line or the subway, right? So the medical autonomy leg, and in many ways, this has sort of distorted some of the other ones in our own medical culture, is very long. The public health autonomy leg is very short. Yeah. So when we think about Catholic healthcare tradition, and we can start back before this, the split between East and West in the 11th century, there's this tradition of religious orders offering hospitality, shelters for travelers, the infirm, the ill, recognizing the dignity of the human person. You could think of Basil of Caesarea and the so-called Basileum that he had, which was a bit of a hostel for travelers. It also provided medical care. It also provided care for elderly people. Or you can think about the Pantocrator or Zenon Hospital in Constantinople in the 12th century also, which had differentiated wards for including male and female physicians, interestingly enough, and different organizations. It had a leprosarium. It had a geronton for would be a place for older people. It had different things. So there's this long tradition of the development of healthcare within the Christian tradition. You can think of the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which you have, if you know the whole story, the guy comes to Jesus and says, you know, how do I inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, well, you know, what does it say in the law? And he says, well, love your neighbor and yourself, blah, 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 blah. And Jesus says, do this and live. And then the guy says, okay, who's my neighbor? And then Jesus tells this story. Okay. And what you see if you look at the story, there are all of these elements in this. There's the people that go by because they have either formal constraints or cultural constraints. There's a person who's a Samaritan who's a kind of a half-breed from the majority population, but Jesus is always using the Samaritans as the example of the virtuous person. So he gives some field emergency care. He provides transport. He does a patient handoff at the end. He sets up for the inpatient care. He provides money for financing for the innkeeper. And he also says, and if it costs more than this when I'm coming back the other way, I'll make up the difference. So he gives upfront payment, he gives a budget, and he provides promise of future financing and follow-up. Okay. And also, healing ministry is also grounded in the ministry of the local church and the responsibilities of the local bishop, whose ambit includes ensuring the moral and religious identity of the healthcare ministry in both the physical and sacramental dimensions. So this is how Catholic healthcare is different than just secular healthcare. There'll be places where they come together. There'll be places where there'll be some collisions. But there's also been a shift from consecrated religious personnel, where many of the people who, like at St. Scholastica, for example, or the hospice that's down the street from where I am, that was founded in a religious order of nuns in this case, who were taking care of people. So there was this complete identity between the religious order and the medical order. And now we have both religious personnel, we have lay people who also are partly in religious orders, and we also have professionalization, which have nothing to do with religious orders. And so the idea of calling versus job, right, and profession means you're professing something, that there's a coherence. And then, of course, there's the technological social developments, which have opportunities and challenges in both terms of dignity and stewardship, but also in some great potentials also. So I just I was relying a lot on my slides from a few months ago, and then I realized November 20th they just updated them like this month, right? So anyway, so I was doing some feverish revisions, you could say, right before class. Don't do this, students. Don't do this. You never do that, right? Um, so the general structures are the same as the previous version. So part one, social responsibility. Part two, pastoral and spiritual responsibility. Three, professional patient relationship. And this is interesting because it's not just doctor patient, but that includes everybody, includes nurses, includes the phlebotomist, it includes everybody. Okay. Includes the janitor also. And issues of care, beginning of life, issues of care if seriously ill and dying, and then collaborative arrangements with other healthcare organizations. So this is acquisitions and mergers, as we say. And the part begins with an introduction and then directives and then sort of articulations of these. And have you all read these? Did you read all of these? There's a couple of things. In a general sense, it says the purpose of these directives is two things. It reaffirms the ethical standards, behavior, and healthcare that flow from the church's teaching about the dignity of the human person and provides authoritative guidance on certain moral issues that face Catholic healthcare today. Now, here there's some clashes, obviously, on things like abortion or some things like contraception, say, other than national family planning, which can be pretty effective if you follow it. But in Canada, there's pressure, and in the Netherlands, there's pressure for Catholic hospices to refer their patients for euthanasia, for example, or Catholic doctors to do the actual killing. So this is really something. And then it also talks about in pluralistic society, this is further down the introduction. It says there's Catholic healthcare servants will encounter requests for medical procedures contrary to the moral teaching of the Catholic Church, in which it retains the right to not do those. To maintain its integrity as a ministry carrying on the work of Jesus Christ, fidelity to the gospel, to provide high quality health care in conformity with Catholic teaching, and by refusing to provide or permit medical interventions which are judged morally wrong. The institutional conscience of the Catholic health care service is rooted in its identity as a ministry formed by the authoritative teaching of the church. So it's not just anything. Now, one thing that's interesting is that although these seem to be very constrained, you also have similar things happening in secular healthcare. And an example, again, is one that Gregor Wolbring talks about the difference between treatment and enhancement, for example. If you're a psychiatrist or the whole question of, say, Ritalin or Adderall, okay? Adderall helps students stay up longer and get better grades, right? Adderall can also be used to treat ADHD. Adderall is basically speed plus sugar, right? It's amphetamine, dextroamphetamine, right? So you have these demands for the Adderall, right? And the kid who's staying up and in final weeks would like to pop a couple of Adderall, they know they'll do better on their exams if they're on this drug, right? So is it within the ambit of healthcare, Catholic or secular, to be the dispenser of that? You see. So, and you have the same thing, these questions about what if somebody is an amputee want to be? Okay. They say, well, if I feel like I'm in the wrong body, gender-wise, why can't I feel like I'm in the wrong body? I feel like I should be an amputee. And Carl Elliott has a really interesting book called Better Than Well. American Medicine Meets the American Dream, where he talks about all these sort of very extreme and interesting contexts where people are putting demands on healthcare. And if I can improve my sight far beyond normal species typical things, is this something that should be covered by health insurance? Okay, so these sorts of things. It's not just that there are constraints that are formal and moral in Catholic context, or the same sorts of things are also going on otherwise. And you can think of healing as fundamental in the Gospels with what Jesus is doing. And so this is, in a Catholic view, you're doing sort of an extension of what Jesus is doing. Now, one of the things that came up between the sixth and seventh editions is on the issue of sex and gender consonance or dissonance. And the Catholic healthcare directive view is that creation is prior to us and must be received as a gift, including to protect our humanity and accepting it, respecting it as it was created. And they have a position of one must not provide or permit medical intervention, surgical or hormonal or genetic, that aim not to restore, but rather to alter fundamental order of the human body and its form or function. And this would include some forms of genetic engineering. So this would include some stuff that's on the transhumanist wish list, for example. for the purposes not medical treatment, and they also include interventions that aim to transform sexual characteristics of the human body into those of the opposite sex. Now, if you have somebody that's an intersex person, then what would you do? And it's interesting. Um, Augustine, if you read the City of God, he has a section which he talks about all these fantastical people and creatures, including people that are hermaphrodites, people who are conjoined twins, people, and are they fully human? People that have maybe a dog's head, or people that have extra digits, and some of these people he knows, and some of them he's heard about, and he basically says, well, they're all human, basically, you know. But the question here is, what are those constraints, and can one work in those? Can one accept those? And are they formal? And what's interesting in the whole gender transgender space when it comes to medical interventions, you see in Europe that there's a lot of places like Sweden, the Scandinavian countries that are moving away, particularly for people who are minors, of doing hormonal interventions, doing surgical interventions. Whereas in America, it's kind of been full steam ahead. And there's some interesting research about psychological outcomes with and without transitions and all of this sort of stuff. But it's all a hot topic. But here, on a Catholic point of view, they say, well, no, one should come to peace in some way with the somatic form that you have. Okay. But on the other hand, the Catholic providers must employ all appropriate resources to mitigate suffering of those who experience gender incongruence or gender dysphoria, and provide a full range for their healthcare needs, employing only those means that respect the fundamental order of the human body. Now, one thing that's interesting too, it's one thing, when you think about there's like this gender box which has like 60 possibilities, or I don't know, all of them, many. It's one thing, a person who's say, I'm going to choose this box or that box as a sort of aesthetic artistic expression. Today I'm going to be this, today I'm going to be, that's one thing. It's another thing to be the person who feels like I'm not in the right body, right? Or I don't feel at home with myself in whatever ways. And that's a very difficult, that's a tough spot to be in, right? And they're not quite the same. Yeah, yeah. Um, there's also a little note on artificial intelligence in the new directives, in which they say technology, including artificial intelligence, can never replace the human relationship between healthcare profession and the patient. Human beings are by nature to be in relationships with persons. And in fact, another saying that Ellis likes to say, my former tutor, the Zen fellow became Christian. He says the meaning of meaning, and this works actually in every domain, in every discipline. The meaning of meaning is relationship. Okay, and this is true whether it's mathematics, whether it's physics, whether it's chemistry, language, within the Trinity, on and on and on. Without relationship, there is no meaning. Anything isolated, it doesn't have a meaning. It's just a thing in isolation. Meaning has to do with the relatedness of two things. And anyway, it's something to think about. There's current issues in AI now with ChatGPT, and maybe you've read some of this. People who have ChatGPT personality friends, right? They're figures that have been ginned up through ChatGPT, and some of them give very bad advice. And in fact, some of them have been implicated in helping people write suicide notes and things like this. Okay. And so when we're talking about cyberspace and with AI, there's all of these pseudo forms of relationship, and there's also great prospects. For example, AI use in radiological analysis for CAT scans and things like that, trying to find the beginnings of tumors. There's some great stuff going on there, right? And there's also the things where AI is going to replace a lot of functions, practical functions. And this is something in healthcare administration. We have it now using AI for scribes, for scribing, for doctors taking notes. And that can be great if it's doing a decent job. And then you go back and make sure that you edit it and make sure it's good. But that can be a great thing. So AI, the impact on the workforce, the impact on the conception of the person, and even on the psychological well-being of people is going to be a thing that's only going to become a bigger issue. And we mentioned some of the elements here, and I won't spend much time here. But the social responsibility includes the sacrality of the person, conception to natural death, the mandate for the poor and the marginalized. Sometimes have you heard of the term the preferential option for the poor? That's something which came out of Latin American theology and point. Basically, it means you should think about how the impact of your policy will affect the most vulnerable, and where you have flexibility, you should choose as a moral, ethical choice to um, to shore up those that are most vulnerable. Okay, as a principle. The common good, economic, social, and political stewardship, equity, subsidiarity. Do you know what subsidiarity is? Now, this is a great thing in Catholic social teaching. Part of it, if you read Rerum Novarum on new things from Pope Leo the 13th from the 1890s, which had to do with the relationship of labor and capital in the emergence of modern technological capitalism, subsidiarity has this idea that it's best to have decision making at the most local level possible, to have the most flexibility or power dispersed at the most local level possible. And then, if the problem is such that it can't be solved on that local level, then bring it to a higher level that's more distant. But the problem is, the more distant that things are, where decisions are made that are far from the people who are going to be affected, the least likely they are going to be responsive to their actual context and interests. And so subsidiarity, and we see it in every context, including universities. We see the problems here where a decision is made that the people most affected don't have control over that decision, right? And it can be pretty catastrophic, right? Where it's like the deal. Is it the juke to get the fog light off? You have to take the bumper off to change the fog light on the juke. You look at it, you think, where was the mechanic on the design team, right? See, the mechanic on the design team, that would be subsidiarity. Okay. Oh, come on. Okay. Um, and then part two of the pastoral and spiritual responsibility. As you would guess, it has to do with recognize a person as being made in the image of God, the whole person. Also have spiritual things, particularly at end of life. There's some disciplines, if you're doing oncology, you're going to run into this a lot more than maybe if you're an orthopedic surgeon, right? So there's different areas, or if you're doing hospice, even more so, right? Um, Last rites, how one works with the pastoral staff and ecumenical and interfaith issues and policies. Okay. The professional patient relationship, the issues of the relational virtues, respect, trust, honesty, confidentiality, mutual participation, the team context, the intersection of the ethical and the technical, the healing of the management, again, the considerations of the whole person. And one of the things one has to think when you think about the spiritual needs of patients, that's something that's very at home in Catholic contexts, less at home in secular contexts, but it's also the spiritual needs of the people that are the providers, right? The doctors, the nurses, those are people that need to be cared for also. Okay. Also, in this relationship, there's the question of the federal law, the legal constraints, the questions of the Catholic teaching and the questions of advanced directives. Um, Again, listening to the patient, informed consent, medical and moral information, rights and duties, the question of transplants. And for living transplants, there's this question of what are my risks if somebody who's a living donor gives a kidney, what are their risks also, right? So you have two patients, maybe they want to do it. I know somebody whose wife gave their husband a kidney, and my comment to her is, boy, that's leverage from here on out. What have you done for me lately? Um, and then the question of ordinary means and extraordinary means, right? In ethics and in things, Catholic ordinary means. We'll have a little slide on that in a bit. But ordinary means in one context may not be ordinary in another. And depending on the resources, and it may be what's not ordinary in one context, but is in another, also may be an issue of broader justice, right? In a resource poor area, some things may not be ordinary at all. You can't do this kind of treatment because it requires this kind of monitoring because there's not a lab to run the blood work every 6 weeks. Okay. Okay. And issues at the beginning of life. Oops. And there's a lot of these issues. Questions of IVF, endangerment, double effect. We'll talk about that just a tiny bit at the end. And then the issues of the seriously ill. Some people who aren't Catholic or don't know the context think that Catholic ethics requires doing everything at extreme cost, no matter what, and no matter what little return on it. Okay. There's a test that I like when people are talking about, is this treatment futile or not? I call it the quarter test. And the quarter test is, if this treatment only cost a quarter, would you use it or not use it? Okay. Now, if it costs $150,000 or how much per quality, how much are we going to pay per quality or something like that? Then it's another dimension. It's a economic dimension that's entering in, right? But the physiological dimension is, if you can do it and it costs a quarter, if you'd say, no, I still wouldn't do it, then you'd say, well, that's probably physiological futility, right? If you say, no, I wouldn't do it because it costs $50,000, well, it's not physiological futility, it's an economic consideration, and we need to be really honest about what we're doing and what we're saying. Also in the research literature. Okay. So all sorts of things, and you can look at my slides later. I'll give them the updated version, which will get posted. Okay. And then the question of collaborative arrangements, and this has become more of an issue just recently, in which Catholic organizations are fusing with non-Catholic organizations. We have the situation with St. Joseph's Hospital in St. Paul, which I think is being mostly, if not completely, deactivated. And
Correct.
the claim was that they're still doing as much as they were doing before. But the fact of the matter is, where it was located in an area where there were a lot of homeless people. And it was serving a lot of homeless people much more than the new location, quote unquote, after the merger with the secular institute, healthcare organization.
Fairview.
Fairview, right. Yeah.
I worked at St. Joe's for 20 years.
Oh, you did. So you know the
Mm-hmm.
story. So you can tell the
Mm-hmm.
story 1,000 times better than I can tell it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the history of St. Joe's, it was established precisely to provide comprehensive care to all who needed it,
Yep.
regardless of their ability to pay.
To pay. Yep.
Yep. And so the pressure to merger is also, when I talk about mission creep, mission sleep, right? Usually at the beginning, the promises are, oh, there will be no difference, Yes, we'll protect all of this, but just like in businesses, that lasts about X number of years, and then new management comes in, and then suddenly all of this stuff goes out the window, right? And it's really tragic. Yeah, yeah,
It was a hard one to swallow.
yeah. It was quite wicked, actually.
Yeah.
What happened? I mean, let's call it what it is.
Yep.
It really was. So there's these different issues that one has. The diocesan bishop has the ultimate responsibility over Catholic healthcare institutions in these sorts of mergers issues. And so you want to avoid contributing to wrongdoing of others. And then there's this sort of cooperation with evil thing about formal cooperation, which means I intend to do something wrong, or material cooperation, I contribute to it. And I have another context where this comes up. We can get it. But also the question of how are the employees treated? What are you going to invest a lot in cardiac care because it's a good money maker, right? Whereas this other area is a money loser, right? And all of the things that are happening now with obstetric care in rural contexts, right? How far do you have to go if you're pregnant and you need to deliver a baby, have a baby? You hear every few months there's some delivery service that's closing. And that increased life risks, right? Including emergency care and things like that. And there's also the question of kind of prudence and the question of scandal. Okay. So you want to have the collaborative arrangements where you can still maintain your witness, where you can still have stewardship and care for the poor, that you can emphasize equity and access for technology expertise, that you can enhance quality of care. Well, everybody is for that. Institutional presence with the preservation and have conformity with moral standards. And then the question is, to what degree can you collaborate with others that don't hold the same standards or views? Okay. For some things, it doesn't make sense that every hospital have the same high-tech equipment. Well, sharing stuff makes sense in a lot of contexts. Okay. And then this was an article in 2022 about the question of access to reproductive care, quote unquote. So this could include contraception, it includes abortion, which the Catholic hospital isn't going to be doing. End of life issues. So here's the Pulsed example. And so that has to do with the standing order for life-sustaining treatments. And these are addressed pretty well in the ethical religious directives. Again, there's a lot of options. One can have an advanced directive. One can have a durable power of attorney. One has the right to refuse care. This is kind of nice. If somebody really understands what you're about, it's much more flexible in many ways than an advanced directive. And it provides more context for having the both together. Again, there's this distinction between ordinary and extraordinary care. There's this question of end of life and general pain management and the principle of double effect. And do you know what the principle of double effect is? Okay, it has the idea of this. If you have a good goal, let's say, remember when I was talking about prudence and could you have a prudent means to a bad end? Okay, you have to have, in Catholic ethical point of view, and I think generally, you have to have a good end you're going for. So let's say knocking down pain at the end of life is a good end, right? So even though in regular life people do all sorts of things voluntarily where they have a lot of pain, people do professional wrestling, people run marathons, people, you know what I mean? People voluntarily embrace, they become Navy SEALs, they embrace all sorts of pain voluntarily, right? But at the end of life, you usually don't want a lot of pain, right? And so holding down pain is a really good thing, is a really good goal. And at the end of life, what's one of the best drugs for dealing with pain? Well, morphine is a great drug, actually. It's been around for a long time, and it's an excellent drug. But it's also a central nervous system depressant, right? It will depress the respiratory drive, right? And so if you give a person a lot of morphine for pain control, or you could use other drugs, fentanyl, whatever. If you do that, there's a danger that it's going to suppress the respiratory drive, which means that it increases the possibility the person will die, right? So then the question is there a difference between somebody who's given effective pain control who dies or somebody who a person says, oh, I'm just going to, because a person's in pain, they'd be better off dead. I'm just going to give them an overdose of morphine. Okay. When both of the people die, right? Both of them die. So the outcome is the same. And the idea of the double effect is that the centrality of the intent is really important. And the means that you can choose that are available for choosing are you try to take the least dangerous means, for example, and you try not to cause the harm, but the harm is secondary to the primary good that you're causing. you know? And so just because the person has an increased chance that it may shorten their life, it's not a reason for not giving them the pain control. Okay. You're not trying to kill them. It's not wink, wink, nod, nod, nudge, nudge. I'm really killing them under the guise of doing this, but I'm intending to do it. But no, you can enter in that. And in certain circumstances, you may not have the outcome that one would want. Now, when my dad was dying of cancer, we had a super nurse who was like a palliative genius, and she could get my dad pain knocked down and mental status clear, you know? And somebody would come in 4 hours later, another shift, and then he would be all out of balance. And Marla would say, "No, no, I had him perfect. I had him perfect," you know. And my dad was an engineer and a pilot, and this guy was sort of a give as good as you get kind of personality, you know. And it was great. And she was very, very good, you know. But everybody's practicing. Not everybody's the greatest baseball hitter of curveballs. Some people hit fastballs better. You know, and every person has their own limitations also in these contexts. So you do the best you can, up to the minimal standards at least. And then there are these options. So that's a different than the issue of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. In euthanasia in Canada, now people are requesting euthanasia. In the Netherlands, you can get euthanasia for psychological conditions straight away. And now people want also good organs for transplantation. And maybe we'll talk more about that later. Okay, and then again, the futility judgment. This is just a handy one, and this is good for a healthcare administrator. I mean, you have to the separation between the financial decisions and the clinical decisions are important to hold. If you get the financial ones driving the clinical ones, you can get into real trouble. Now, there are constraints where there may be things you can't do at a particular institution. You know, we have level 1, 2, 3, trauma care, you know. Not everybody does the same thing, right? And knowing when to hand off is an important thing. Go faster, faster, faster. Okay, so here's the pulse. So, here's the ordinary and extraordinary, okay? Now, whether a treatment is beneficial, ordinary, or excessively burdensome, which could become extraordinary, is, in a sense, is relative also to the pay. I should just read. What distinguishes ordinary from extraordinary in Catholic theology is not whether the treatment is usual in the sense of being normal or frequently used, but rather whether the treatment is beneficial or excessively burdensome. Now, ordinary medical care is largely an intervention that is generally accepted as effective, not terribly burdensome or expensive. So, like if you're going to have medical care that would completely bankrupt a community, even though you could do it in a very rich community, then it wouldn't be ordinary for the poor community. The fact that the poor community can't afford it may be a matter of injustice, right? But in terms of the local medical context, it's not necessarily ordinary. And it could be from place to place. And here's where international equity issues come to play. And this is also where these issues of the preferential option for the poor in terms of healthcare policy and provision come into play. So extraordinary care is an area of moral freedom. This is like also experimental treatments, right? Experimental drugs, you know? Like for example, my dad had gone through VF4, I think was the code for the drug he had, the oncology drug. And he was signed up for another drug, and the nurse said to him, she said, "Mr. Allison, I just want to tell you this drug's side effects are really harsh. And if you do this, your life is not going to be the same after this, what you'll be able to do or not." And she said, "I just want to be really honest with you. Most people," and my dad had a pretty low side effect profile. So, you know, he did pretty well with a lot of stuff. But he was the engineer, he was the pilot, you know, he was the analytical guy. And she said, "I just want to tell you because I care for you." And then he said, "No, I would rather live 3 months shorter and have better quality of life up front and be able to do things and be with people and see people and plan things and do things than to maybe squeak out an extra 6 weeks at the end and be a total mess, you know? So that was a prudential judgment, and he could have gone either way. And from a Catholic moral point of view, that would be great. You could go either way. Now, from a Catholic point of view, because we don't own ourselves, we're made in the image of God, and we have a steward over our lives. If you're a person that had type 1 diabetes and were insulin dependent, and you could live 20 years taking insulin, and it wouldn't bankrupt you since just recently it was made cheaper again, right? You would have, from a Catholic point of view and a spiritual point of view, you would have and because your life is a good that you should steward in a good way to the glory of God and to serve your fellow human man, then even though in secular bioethics it's fine if you don't want to take it, you can go ahead and not take it and die, even though you'd live 20 years longer. But from a Catholic moral, theological, medical point of view, no, you really should take this treatment because the good of your life isn't something that you have total ownership over just to throw away arbitrarily. You see? Now that the I'm autonomous and I am the king of everything, I can do anything I want with my life point of view isn't consistent with that point of view and the other way around too, right? And and so one of the deals is if people who are from the I can throw my life away point of view, you can try to invite them into your moral universe, right? I mean, ultimately they're going to do what they're going to do, but you don't try to facilitate them to doing an exit like that, for example. And we talked about double effect. So the goal has to be morally good or at least neutral, and the intent of the good effect is intended. The bad effect is just tolerated, and the good has to be better than the bad. Okay, so that's kind of a utilitarian measure. That's just and there's some judgment in that, and the good effect must not be obtained by means of the evil effect. So I'm going to solve the fact that you can't get better housing in Canada and you have allergies, environmental allergies by euthanizing you, which is actually taking place in Canada now. There's people who, in the social context of not being able to get public housing that doesn't have all these allergens, are choosing to be killed, and the medical establishment is willing to do it. It's so. So we just this simple difference between aggressive pain management risking death versus intentional assisting or direct killing is we already talked about. Now, here's the pulse. And so providers' orders for life-sustaining treatment, there was a 2009 and 2017 version. This is the 2009 one. And we'll just look at a couple of things. What I only want you to look at is are the order of things. Okay, it has different sections. Some sections have to do with medication. Some sections have to do with resuscitation. Some sections have to do with treatment with ventilators and with feeding. So this one, it says do CPR or don't do CPR. So you can check one of the two boxes. Now, when not in cardiopulmonary risk, follow B, C, and D. Okay. So if it says do not resuscitate, then you're done, right? The person codes, they're done, right? So comfort care. Now, what's interesting here for comfort care, they say do not intubate. They have the order comfort care, limited interventions and treating reversible conditions. And they have provide life-sustaining treatment. So this is the order on the page. And so comfort care is avoid calling 911, do not transport, do not admit, limiting life interventions and treating irreversible conditions, do not intubate, do a trial intubation or intubate as long as necessary, provide life-sustaining treatment, intubate, cardiovert, do other things. But this is the order that it's given in. Oops. And then other antibiotics. Okay, no antibiotics, oral antibiotics, use IV antibiotics. And nutrition and hydrations, by mouth, by nose, GI, IV, or none by any route. Okay. Obviously, if you have none by any route, eventually you're going to die for sure. Okay. So here with the antibiotics, the default here is no antibiotics. That's the first one. And we know from, research on elections, if you have all of the ballots with the same people at the top as the first choice, the other people as the second choice, the other people as the third choice, the order of things matters. The orders of things matters. Now, here's the updated form for 2017. And what's interesting is that they've reversed the order. Remember before they had comfort care as first, they had selective treatment as second, and they had full treatment as last. Okay. A lot of people, including people in the disability community, said, hey, we don't like that order because it always defaults to the cheapest and fastest death. And so the new PULSed form has reversed that, where full treatment is given as first, selective treatment with a lot of examples, and comfort focused care with a lot of examples is now that. And artificially administered nutrition, rather than starting with none and this, they have it doing long-term nutrition, defined period nutrition, or no. So they've reversed this also. Antibiotics, before it was no antibiotics first. Now it's use antibiotics first, you see. So the institutional, when physicians are given forms and they start checking things off and they see things in forms, that actually also impacts their judgment on how they think about things, right? And this is giving the preferential option for life, you might say. Okay. And then additional preferences. Okay. Just a little bit on my activity with the question of China's issue. Originally, there was a woman who had a big moment of protest in the Rose Garden of the White House when George Bush was president. And she was an MD. She had an MD from China, and she had a PhD from University of Chicago. And she was also in the press corps for the Falun Gong group. The Falun Gong group is a group that's a combination of Buddhism and Taoism. And there's a rather charismatic leader of this group who's now living in exile in the United States, Hongji Li, who is the leader of it, and is an indigenous Chinese sort of Tai Chi like related also physical practices. And they became Hongji Li started this, and within about 15 years, it became a very widespread practice where you'd see people doing Falun Gong exercises, like Tai Chi exercises in the parks early in the morning. Their motto is truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. Not exactly what I always think of when I think of the Chinese Communist Party, you know. Um, and it's an indigenous Chinese syncretism, if you will. And it became so popular that the number of people practicing it became more than or equal to the number of people who were members of the Communist Party. And in fact, many of the people who were in the Communist Party also started practicing this, including the wives of some people on the Politburo. One of the people that I gave testimony with, Erping Zhang from China, he was in the security services. He was like in the intelligence section of the security services. He got introduced in Falun Gong through a seminar that was sponsored by the security service. Okay. What happened was that there was a protest when some Falun Gong people were arrested. There was a protest outside in the area near the Forbidden City where the premier's office is. There's also an ombudsman's office there. And suddenly there were 10,000 people showed up to protest the treatment of these Falun Gong practitioners. And the person who was the president was Jiang Zemin. And Jiang Zemin is the person who put down the democracy protest in Shanghai, which is the largest city in China. And he decided these people are a threat, like the Boxer Rebellion, which was also an indigenous thing, but against colonialism. These people are a threat and they have to be destroyed. And there was suddenly mass, now instead of Falun Gong being good, being healthy practice, they're now an evil cult, et cetera, et cetera. There were mass arrests. There were days on end of anti-Falun Gong propaganda. There was the establishment of the 610 office in 1999 on June the 10th, which was given extra powers, extrajudicial authority to arrest people. Hundreds of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners went into re-education by labor camps. Many of them didn't identify themselves because they didn't want to get their families into trouble. Okay. So right after the 610 office program was established, Li King, who is the head of the 610 office in the Great Hall of the People, said that the purpose of their new initiative was to eradicate Falun Gong by defaming their reputations, bankrupting them financially, or destroying them physically. So suddenly in China, there were large numbers of organs available for transplantation closely after this. So, what were the conditions of possibility? The former vice chair, the vice chair of for health, vice minister for health, was a liver transplant surgeon. He admitted that almost all of the organs, first of all, came from executed people in China. These were, first of all, judicially executed people for one of any 50 crimes. Now we have all of these Falun Gong people who are political prisoners. So you had large numbers of non-judicial deaths and detentions confirmed for Falun Gong, and also that the Falun Gong people in these re-education camps are getting blood typed, they're getting chest X-rays, but they're also being treated very badly. So it's clearly not for their benefit. Okay, on the revised procedural law in 1997, so 2 years before the persecution, there were 68 capital crimes. You have pretty inadequate representation of defendants and appeals process, and the use of executed organs was already established. Early on, there was even quite a few coming from people who are Uyghurs. Now, if you're thinking about the expansion, so the persecution starts in 1999. The number of kidney centers tripled in 2001 to 2005 to 100, from 106 to 368 across China. And the number of liver transplant centers from 1998 to 2006 went from 22 to over 500 across China. Now, the thing about a kidney is that you can give a kidney and survive. The thing about a whole liver transplant, this is for whole liver transplantation, not partial liver transplant. If you have a liver, you have a dead person on the other side of the equation, okay? So the Orient Organ Transplant Center for whole livers went from 9 livers transplanted in 1998 to 1,601 livers transplanted in 2004. Now think about the waiting lists in liberal democracies where we have all these cards being carried, etc. Okay. Matthew Robertson and the fellow who was the head of the UK's Public Health Services biostatistics division did a study in which they looked at the reported increases of availability of organs in China and compared that with the development of availability in like 50 other countries that aren't under totalitarian conditions. And the one in China that were being reported matched a very specific quadratic equation form, which none of the other increases in donations in any of the other countries came anywhere near. Okay. So the 6-year total then for livers was 2,248. So this is from this one hospital, and here you just see 1998 and 2004, 1,601. Okay. Then there was this is a screenshot I made in 2007. This is a China International Transplant Network Assistance Center. It used to be at this location. It's no longer been taken down. And they say on their website to international transplant tourists, viscera providers can be found immediately, exclamation point. In accordance with Chinese law, the viscera are provided by state-owned hospitals. The Transplantation Assistance Center, which mainly focuses on foreigners, was founded in 2003. So this was 4 years after the beginning of the Falun Gong persecution. Okay. And the doctors and nurses are fluent in English because they've all studied abroad. So how is this? Think of a healthcare administration standpoint of this organ procurement system, this OPO. Okay. So, so there's this additional one here, and we'll get to the OPO. Well, this is the OPO. Facts of Chinese transplantation. Okay, there are more than 35,000 kidney transplants done in public hospitals in 29 cities. Blah blah blah. So many transplantation operations are owing to the support of the Chinese government, and this is the organ transplantation vertical integration. The Supreme Democratic Court, that's the Supreme Court. The Supreme Democratic Law Officer, that's the Chief Justice. The police, the judiciary, the Department of Health and Civil Administration have enacted a law together to make sure that organ donations are supported by the government. This is unique in the world. Yeah. So there's a student, Hua Wang, who is a economics student who did a study on China's organ transplant industry and Falun Gong organ harvesting and economic analysis for his thesis. And basically, he was looking at the characteristics of demand markets, where there are long wait times, where there's excess demand, and excess supply markets where short wait times. And his conclusion in this, and he ran regression equations and so forth and all of this. In China's supply-driven market, the waiting times are exceedingly short because the recipients are not waiting for a relatively static number of organs procured every year from natural deaths. They're only waiting for a suitable blood group and HLA matches with the organs from existing organ inventory of living suppliers. So this is what I call the lobster in the tank model. You have all the lobsters characterized, and then you get this HLA from a patient, then you get this lobster over here. And so David Mattis and David Kilgore were asked by the Falun Gong people to do investigation. David Mattis is a human rights lawyer in Canada, and he was awarded recently the Order of Canada. David Kilgore was a member of parliament who was also formerly the Secretary of State for Asia Pacific in Canada. So China was part of his bailiwick. And they set up calls to various medical and detention centers with Chinese people doing the calls, asking about the availability of organs. Now, at the same time, Manfred Speaker, who was the special rapporteur on issues of torture and cruel and inhumane treatment and punishment, did a study in China, was allowed to come to China, and he looked at reports of people dying in detention, and the numbers of people dying, the percentage of people that are dying in detention from almost zero Falun Gong before the persecution to about 5 years into it had gone from 0% to 60 to 70% of the people being beaten to death in detention were Falun Gong practitioners. Now, if you beat somebody to death, obviously their liver's not going to be in great shape, right? But the basic thing is, if there are such non-persons that you can beat so many people to death in detention without any consequences, and these bodies are available, and the prices on the international market comes to be about 200,000 plus a body when you get lungs, heart, kidneys, eyes, and everything, then you sell them out on the international market, then you can make a lot of money, literally hell of a lot of money per body of people who have no status. And so these were the different areas, including Xinjiang. This is where the Uyghurs are now. Inner Mongolia, Heilongjiang, Hebei, Shandong, Shanghai, Henan, Hubei, Sichuan, Guangxi, Guangdong. So these are places where people at these institutions admitted that they were using organs from Falun Gong practitioners. And so they recorded these telephone calls, and from the Mission City Detention Center on the 8th of June in 2006. Hi, do you have Falun Gong or organ suppliers? Lee is the name of the person on the other end. Yes, we have. Yes. What about now? Yes, we do. Sometimes they would say, you need to get the organs before the end of the year for the regular executees and things like that. The woman who made the stink in the Rose Garden when the president of China was there with President Bush, she brought to me with another Falun Gong practitioner, they brought me the transcripts of calls that they had done themselves when I was at the Program in Human Rights and Health, and with the recordings of them, where the various medical institutions um, admitted to the uses of the Falun Gong as the sources for organs. So there is a independent tribunal into forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience in China that was set up by Sir Geoffrey Nice. He was the former prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, for the International Criminal Court on Yugoslavia, and had weeks and weeks of testimony and evidence. And at the end, the conclusion was, combining the conclusions, there's been a population of donors accessible to hospitals in the People's Republic of China whose organs can be extracted according to demand for them. And this has coincided with the long-term practice of the PRC of forced organ harvesting. And many Falun Gong, along with Uyghurs, have been compelled to have medical tests focusing on their organs. Um, these organs could be extracted according to demand. This process of all of the evidence leads inexorably to the conclusion that in the long-term practice in the PRC, which explains this huge increase, forced organ harvesting, it was indeed Falun Gong practitioners who were used as a source and probably the principal source of forced organ harvesting. And now the Uyghurs, the whole Uyghur population has also been blood typed. And some tourists. There was this Japanese Nomura who was a tourist in Xinjiang province at Kashgar Airport, which is the capital, where it's the middle of Uyghur land, basically. He took this picture of this arrow in the airport terminal, and he says the priority lane that has been installed at the Kashgar Airport in Xinjiang, in simplified Chinese and Arabic, it translates special passengers and human organ exportation lane. Okay. And this is in Uyghur land. So do we have so many organs that are available that many at MSP, at the Humphrey terminal and at the Lindbergh terminal, that we have a special lane for, well, we have the special go through, if you pay your $100 to TSA, you can go through faster, but we don't have a special lane for organ transplant facilitation. Okay. And I wrote a chapter for this book, and the chapter was basically called China's Execution Transplantation System and International Institutions, a Too Sticky Wicket. And it basically looked at the benefits that Western actors have received in this, including pharmaceutical companies who are doing large-scale trials of anti-rejection drugs in China on populations of liver transplant recipients who could have only gotten their organs from executees. And so that was the basic, that's the basic thing. And we've already, there was a Transplantation Association letter to, that's the main international transplant organization of the world. And the Transplantation Society member letter basically said, okay, almost all the organs are coming from executed prisoners. And then it says, astonishingly, the Transplantation Society cannot dictate to China that its practice regarding capital punishment is unethical. Even though everybody knows that what a terrible system of representation there, the TTS should express concern that recovery of organs from the executed prisoners has resulted in rampant commercialism and transplant tourism, and also strongly emphasizing the unlikelihood of free consent by the prisoners, and the financial incentive for recovering organs from executed prisoners may become an incentive to increase the number of such organs from availability from transplantation. Well, okay. But then it says, instead of saying we should cut off all support of Chinese transplantation, it tries to do constructive engagement. So member lecturers and expertise may support China's transplantation program as far as possible if it does not promote executee use. So you can still go and do lectures on advances in technique for transplantation in China. Okay. And it also encourages Western institutions to accept new transplant trainees from executee using programs from China if, as far as possible, they are intent to follow TTS ethical guidelines in the future. Now, this is just basically expanding the capacity to transplant organs from executees because over 90% of the organs are coming from executees. And whatever they want to do, they have institutional constraints. If they're going to work as a transplant surgeon, they're not going to be able to say at the Zhengzhou hospital, oh, I'm only going to do 1 in 10 transplants because that one's coming from a voluntary person who's giving a kidney to their cousin. Okay. And also the TTS webpage was sponsored by all of these pharmaceutical companies. And here's an example with Hoffmann La Roche, the Swiss company. It began anti-rejection drug trials in China in April of 2006. And remember the level of transplants on the curve. On March 16, 2006, Roche was involved in a trial at Shanghai Jiaotong University Hospital's Liver Transplant Center where Dr. Dai was identified as saying that organs were available within a week, including Falun Gong sources on those calls done by David Kilgore and David Mattis. Okay, so this is one of the doctors that admitted to using Falun Gong organs. He was in this hospital where Roche was doing this trial, and Arnie Roche Schwartz, who's quite a good investigative journalist, queried Roche compliance officer in 2009. And the response from Roche is, the thing is, are you being sure that these people that you're doing your anti-rejection drug trials aren't being given organs from people who are politically murdered for these organs? And the response of Roche is stunning in that they dress it up in this ethical language, almost HIPAA language. Roche is, as mentioned above, neither in China nor in any other country of the world in charge of the supply of organs. Anonymity and privacy of the most highly personal donor data are protected by law. Roche is not entitled to know from where or from which donors the transplant organs come. So they just continue doing their research in China. Okay. So I mentioned the cooperation of evil, in evil, So formal cooperation means you actually will to do something that's evil. That's always wrong. Okay. But material cooperation means giving stuff that may be used in the act of the evil. So this would be like selling Cyclone B to the Nazis, for example. That would be an example. So immediate cooperation is material that's required for it. So this may include aftercare stuff. This could include transplantation monitors or drugs or aftercare requirements. Immediate cooperation is not essential, but it somehow supports it. So maybe you're the electrician working on keeping the electricity running in the hospital. Okay. They need the electricity to do the operation because they need the lights to do the operation, right? But they don't need to do this. You could run it on a generator. You're not involved in the direct activity of the transplant or the taking of the organs from a prisoner. And if it's proximate, it leads to an act. If it's remote, it doesn't lead to an act. So anyway, one of the things that's good about this sort of a thing is sometimes if you're in a situation that's very morally complex, and like the parable of the dishonest steward about the money, the stuff gets dirty somewhere along the line. If you're in a morally complex situation, you can use this to sort of figure out how close is my responsibility and my involvement in this, and where do I draw a line that I say, no, I can't do this. I can't participate in this, even if I'm indirectly doing this. Okay. Now, I was mentioning what was going on in the Netherlands. Now, in the Netherlands and in Belgium both, they have this thing of medical lethality and transplantation. And I asked the question on perverse incentives and conflicts of interest in the medical scene. So this is an article from 2023 from Transplant International, a major mainstream journal. Organ donation after euthanasia in patients suffering from psychiatric disorders, 10 years of preliminary experiences in the Netherlands. Euthanasia based on psychiatric suffering following by subsequent organ donation is considered medically and legally permissible in the Netherlands, although organ donation after euthanasia, which they call ODE here, in patients suffering from unbearable psychiatric illness, is performed. It is not specifically addressed by the Dutch guidelines on organ donations, et cetera, et cetera. So they're saying that patients who are wanting to donate their organs, okay? So the question is, if you're studying from schizophrenia and you're not going to die in the next 20 years in the Netherlands, you can say, this is unbearable. I want the medical establishment to kill me. Okay. And I want to give my organs. Now, we know in societies, organ donors are valorized as social heroes and all sorts of things, right? So you end up with a situation in which you don't value your life, but we really value your organs as institutional administrative medicine, right? And you also have these situations, even in American medicine, you sometimes have these things where we're trying to separate the people who are declaring death from the people who are going to extract organs, from the people who are talking to the families to see if they'll give their child's organs up for transplantation. And there can be messy stuff going on there too with conflicts of interest. There's also examples of different things um, where there's new suggestions of changing the kinds of treatments because if the person dies, then this will help preserve the organs and make them better for transplantation. So, so the thing about how do you make something into a medical thing? Remember, ODE up here meant organ donation after euthanasia. Now, acronyms are very handy in medicine because some words are 20 meters long, right? But once you make an acronym, if you say, I'm not talking about organ donation after euthanasia, I'm talking about ODE. We're just talking about ODE. You don't actually have to say the words, right? You can just use the acronym, and it's much easier socially to become habituated. Well, this is an article in Transplantation, which is the official journal of the Transplantation Society, the one that we mentioned before. And this is from 2020. Organ donation, euthanasia, performing euthanasia through living organ donation. So this is Bolin again. So we're moving from the Hippocratic Oath, I will not give a poison or advise such, even if asked, right? I will not do a lethal act, to, okay, we're going to do a physician-assisted suicide, which means a physician-assisted suicide means at least the patient has to take the pills themselves or sip the slurry, to direct euthanasia, which means the patient doesn't have to do it, I'll do it. Third party does the killing. To, okay, now we're getting organs from people who are psychiatric patients. And it turns out in Belgium, there was a series 100 requests for psychiatric euthanasia. And the numbers in every age group of women to men was like 3-to-1, 4-to-1 until you got very old. Okay, so 4 times as many women were requesting psychiatric euthanasia compared to men. And the explanation that was given in the article was, well, women suffer more from mental illness, so they're asking more of them are asking to be killed to be free of their suffering. Okay. Bolin and company are saying we're investigating the medical, legal, and ethical arguments for performing organ donation in an anesthetized patient. We have called this organ donation euthanasia, ODE. So now instead of it being getting the organs after the person is dead, now it's killing the person by taking the organs for transplantation. The patient does not die as a result from the administered euthanasia drugs, but receives anesthesia before the organs, including the heart, are taken out, which causes the death. Okay. I gave a talk at L'Abri Fellowship on my article, which I'll show you a picture of in a sec. We're almost done. And I had a picture of the Aztec, the Aztec 1600 painting of the person having their heart carved out with an obsidian scalpel on the one side and a surgeon extracting a heart on the other side. Okay. Now this hasn't been okayed yet, but you just see the logic, the utilitarian logic is, well, if we have people doing euthanasia, then some of them could be good for organ donors. Well, if we have psychiatric people, they're sick in the mind, but they're healthy in the body. They're even better organs, right? Well, if you're going to take the organs and you're going to kill the person anyway, then why not kill the person by taking the organs, because that will preserve the quality of the organs and that has higher utility. Okay. Anyway, this is my article on the history of medical homicide, which you can, it's open access. So if you just go Google and you say Kirk Allison and you say medical homicide, you'll get to a link that's published by Intech Open, which does tons and tons of open access publishing. And it's in a volume called Global Bioethics, Current Challenges and New Developments. Future Direction is published in June of 2025. And I talk about the context of including some interesting material on Blackstone's commentaries on English law, where he talks about the nature of suicide and homicide, and the nature of um, uh, public goods and private goods, and public injuries and private injuries. Which ones are social? Which ones are not? So, like in Minnesota, if somebody attacks you on the street and beats you over the head, I hope it doesn't happen, the district attorney brings the charges on the part of the state. Now, you can also sue them as an individual in civil court, right, for damages. But the district attorney is bringing the charges on the part of the state because the state has an interest in maintaining social order for everybody in the society, you see? And if they don't get convicted, you can still sue them in civil court. And if you get, preponderance of the evidence versus beyond a reasonable doubt, then you can win money, right? For wrongful death or for wrongful injury or something, right? So part of the question is in the language, including in assisted suicide, or is it just my personal decision? Is it just my private interest? Or are there systemic elements? And again, as I mentioned, in Canada, you're having situations where people are asking to be euthanized because they can't get better housing and they have chronic conditions, and the chronic condition is enough to meet the standard of an irreversible condition of suffering. And there's some bioethicists, which I talk about in this paper also, who say, well, they're still acting autonomously even though it's a tragic situation. Okay. But obviously the perverse incentive is one woman who had these allergies who ended up being euthanized. And the doctors tried to find other alternatives. The doctors have done the killings were trying to help her to get better housing because they thought it was so crazy, right? But she still didn't get the housing, and she still died of euthanasia. And she said, the people in the government office think I'm a pain in the ass, and they would really like me to go away. I'm so exhausted now, I just can't deal with it anymore. Well, hopefully institutions want to help the people in governmental institutions, but if the safety valve is difficult people, if you don't treat them well, may just off themselves, that's also a perverse incentive in society. And so I look at that. I look at things going also from the Greek context all the way, compare 1789 France with 2025 Florida on medicalized executions. And then the transplantations, I compare China under totalitarianism and the Netherlands and Belgium under liberal democracy and the directions that things are going. Anyway, this gets back to my German context. This is my last slide. I'll let you go. Franz von Sickingen, a Tragödie in fünf Akten by Daniel de Leon. He was a early socialist, Daniel de Leon, in the 19th century, early 20th century. This was published in New York, the translation by the Labor News Company. Okay. Franz von Sickingen was sort of a popular uprising hero. He was kind of a popular revolutionary figure. And at the end, at this one point in this, there are two people that have these long sort of philosophical conversations in this play. And one of them says to the other in German, and in the article I have it both in English and German, he says, do not show the goal, show also the course, for so tangled are end and means on earth that one always turns with the other, and the other means birth also other ends. So another translation said, for the means are ends in embryo. So the thing that's happening, for example, in transplantation, something that could be a good can be turned into an evil if the means are an evil means, right? And the same thing when you hear, excuse me, when you hear people talking about changing the definition of death because it will make it possible to have more transplant organs, then we're no longer doing physiology. We're no longer doing science. We're doing supply and demand. We're doing economics. And and so watch the language, watch the incentives, just like follow the money, follow the incentives. And so just remember when you're yourself doing your administrative work or whatever context you're doing in public activities and even private, remember when you're thinking about ethics and morals, think about the means, the ends, and the prudential judgment, what's involved. Think about what are the competing interests. Think about what are the populations that are affected. Think about the trade-offs and think about, when is something in a state that you have to protest against it, you have to pull the orange handle and eject out of the plane and say, I'm not going to support this. I'm not going to materially participate in this because what's going on here is so bad. So anyway, um, I wish I could have a more cheery ending for you. But that, as my professor from the Integrated Humanities program, they gave a lecture for freshmen and sophomores in the program who were having trouble academically, and they gave a lecture called "What the Turkey Knows" right before Thanksgiving. And he said, however bad your situation is, it's not as bad as that for the turkey. And then Professor Quinn talked about how he flunked chemistry, he flunked the lab, he flunked the lecture, he flunked it every way. And it was the best thing that happened to him because he ended up in English literature, and which was the place that he was really called to be. So, anyway, with that, thank you very much for the
Yeah.
opportunity.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Dr. Allison, and it was great hearing all of, I mean, everything. I, the Chinese organ harvesting and things, it's things you kind of hear about, but you definitely, you know, like I guess, you hear about it, you wonder if it's true, but so it was good to hear all of your insight tonight on it and things like that. And I just heard um an NPR talk about the what's going on up in Canada too. And
Hmm.
so it's all just fascinating and yeah, lots of ethical issues to consider. So
Yeah. Well, thank you, and I'll send the updated slides here
yeah, yeah, do that. And
with the last minute additions. I'll be sending them to our great help, Nate, and
yeah,
he can post those up, and you guys can have them and use them, and you can click on the link if you want my article, you can have it. It's free. So
okay. Thank you
yeah.
so much and happy Thanksgiving, Dr. Allison.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really really glad to be here.
Yep. Take care.
Yeah. Bye.
Right. Okay. Let's see here. There we go. All right. Oh, sorry, it went a little too long, guys. Um, I I just was gonna at the end today, I just was gonna see if you had any questions for me about any of the upcoming assignments or anything that's happening with the MHA program.
Not really.
Okay. Becky, you have
Becky, do
anything?
you?
Um, are we gonna get the more weeks opened up pretty soon, or?
Yeah, good question. I thought they were, hold on, let me just look. I feel like Sue had them set up to release and open on their own, but maybe not. Give me one sec here.
Yeah, I don't think so because I think she did the first 5 weeks all at once at the beginning.
Got it.
Yeah,
There
that's
we
true.
go. Unit Unit 6 is open. I'll do it right now. I'll open all of them. 7, 8. Yep. Yeah, in Brightspace, we have the option of setting it up to be automatically opened, or you can manually open them. So I just manually opened all the rest. So
Okay.
Perfect.
there you
And
go.
then for our discussions tonight,
Yeah, how do you want to handle that?
yeah.
So what has Sue done in the past? Maybe you guys can give me some insight.
So for class, she allots like the first hour to the speaker. Then we take a break, and then we do our discussions live, and then we chat and go back and forth and talk about
Okay.
industry standards and stuff like that for the last half.
Well, we won't worry about that because Dr. Allison took all of our time. So we're done for the night. I'm not
Okay.
gonna, make you guys stick but I would encourage you to maybe keep an eye on what Dominic and Patrick share in the online discussion. If you guys can add any insight there,
Okay.
that would be great. Just make some comments and things. So
Okay.
sound good?
Want
Yeah.
us to post our discussions online then, or
No,
okay?
no. Just watch for Dominic and Patrick's and reply to them. No worries. Okay. All right.
Okay.
All right.
Sound good?
Thank you.
Okay.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yes, same to you too. And take care. We'll
Okay.
see you next week.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Thank